to Richo and Jones. In our Perth studio is Senator Chris Back. Now, Senator Back's going to talk to us tonight about wind power. And there's been a lot of that around here tonight, let me assure you.
If it was reality TV, I would be in a bit of trouble. But we'll keep talking and he might be able to tell you why. No, it's not so much about wind power that we're talking, though.
Yes.
Is that, as I said to you, everywhere you go, and Chris, welcome to the show, but this big issue about electricity prices and renewable energy targets, and you've talked a lot about this in the Senate. I should say that Chris is a West Australian senator, but a graduate of Queensland University in veterinary science, so he is a veterinary scientist. But you've talked a lot about this in the Senate, almost to an empty house, and out there in Struggle Street, they just see the electricity prices continue to climb. You're in government, your team's in government. When are we going to simply say the renewable energy targets, where we're going to have 40% of our energy coming from this source, solar and wind, 3 and 4 and 5 times more expensive than coal-fired power? When's someone going to say this is distorting the market and people out in the suburbs are paying for it?
Well, there's no doubt at all. It's the biggest issue, certainly in Western Australia and generally around Australia. And I've come to learn from my attendance at the Australian Petroleum and Production Exploration Conference this week. It's huge in Europe. I've just been in the United States with Senator Mark Bishop, who you were referring to a few minutes ago. We had 3 months in the United States, and I can assure you that the cost of energy to consumers is very, very high there. The reality, of course, is that Australia was once a country of cheap energy. In fact, if you think about it, with 23 million people in a landmass approximately the size of mainland America, excluding Alaska, the thing that actually got us to our level of per capita wealth in the past was electricity, and that's no longer the case. In fact, of the 6 most expensive places for domestic electricity now, we are 4 of those 6. South Australia, New South Wales, Western Australia are 3 of them, and of course the only 2 above us are indeed Denmark and Germany.
And our economic advantage, didn't it, came for years and years from abundant supplies of cheap energy. Now we're feeding this renewable energy rubbish into the grid. Electricity prices are going through the roof, and out there in Struggle Street, people are paying for this ridiculous ideological position on energy.
Well, what's interesting is the most expensive place in the world for domestic electricity is Denmark, which of course has a very high level of renewables, including wind turbines. In the case of the Danes, they have to buy peak power at higher prices from the Germans and the Norwegians. The Germans are partially using coal, partially in the past anyhow using nuclear. The Norwegians principally hydro. And when they sell their wind generated power back at a lower price off peak, obviously they do so at a cheaper price. Germany's interesting in the sense that they've actually started to close up their nuclear power stations and reopen coal. Here in Australia, we have the circumstance that the most expensive state indeed is South Australia, which is relying 30% on renewables. But the point that's got to be made in this whole exercise is that if carbon abatement is an issue, then at those times when the wind doesn't blow, they've got to make sure that they've got sufficient gas-fired baseload power. And when they've got to crank that up to meet their baseload demand, it's probable that the carbon benefit is nil or very close to nil because of the increased demand for gas at those times the renewables can't supply the market.
Chris, can I just ask you about South Australia? Because if you get the train from Adelaide to Sydney, which I did in the holidays in January, you go past the biggest wind farm in Australia, and you're actually in the train, you go past, it takes about 20 minutes to get by it, even though you're going fast.
Yeah, more wind farms in South Australia.
There are just hundreds and hundreds of turbines.
Yeah.
Now, what is the difference in cost of electricity produced by wind turbines to that produced by coal?
Oh, heavens.
Well,
300%.
it's about 3 times the cost. In general terms, if you include spot price against spot price. You've always got to be very careful in this exercise, of course. You know, some people talk long-term contracts on one side and they'll talk spot pricing on the other. When it comes to wind turbines at the moment, spot price to spot price, it's about 3 times, and solar energy, in fact, is about 10 times.
Yeah, solar energy is really bad. I know.
Chris, just one other point here, Chris. You see, the people watching you now are paying twice. They're paying in high electricity prices, but they're also paying massive subsidies. If wind power and solar power companies were asked to survive on their own without massive government subsidies, they'd go broke. So the taxpayer is funding this stuff.
That is correct, and in my own state in Western Australia, where a lot of people have now put solar panels on the roofs, they're enjoying the benefit of the solar power itself, which is good. Any excess they're actually selling back to the grid at a premium, but they're very, very well protected. They've got a safety net under them, and that is that if for any reason the renewable is not available to them because of cloudy conditions in the case of solar, or wind not blowing in the case of wind turbines, they've got that very safe, cheaper power, but they're not paying for the distribution, they're not paying for the generation, they're not paying for the standby generation capacity of the base load.
But, is it worthwhile then, when you see a new suburb, these days we tend to regard it as brilliant, perfect and wonderful, if there is a solar panel on every roof? Is that a good idea or not?
Well, as I say, the price of solar energy is coming down, there's no doubt about that, but of course it's still very, very much higher than the other forms of baseload generation
and
capacity.
It is subsidised. This is my bit, Chris, sorry to interrupt you,
well,
but it is subsidised. Now, only in November 2012 we had the International Energy Agency Executive Director in Australia, Maria van der Hoeven, and she said that the renewable energy obsession had cost the United States $88 billion in 1 year. The point that has to be made, these outfits couldn't survive if they didn't have massive taxpayer subsidies. Now,
absolutely.
God, Richo and I could run a business if the taxpayer was going to pick up the tab.
Well, obviously, but how much did we spend on it then? How much did Australia spend the last year on this?
Look, I don't have that figure. But as you know, if you want to have a quick chat about the Renewable Energy Target, and that's an interesting subject at the moment, of course, but a couple of points about it. As Mark Butler said in a discussion I had in the Perth Town Hall the other night, the mandatory RET, as it's called, was introduced under the Howard government in 2001. It was always up for renewal and review, review in 2014. A very, very good panel of people have been put together to actually look at the RET to decide some of the questions you're asking, in fact. What effect, if anything, is it having on emissions reduction? What's it having on the electricity price? What's it having on the price to consumers? And, of course, to what extent does it need support into the future? Now, those 4 people undertaking that review are expected to actually give their findings to the ministers Greg Hunt and Ian Macfarlane by mid-year, and that will then feed into the Energy White Paper. So that's going to be a very, very interesting exercise. Because
meantime,
they have been chosen from sort of 4 different areas, if you like, people well experienced to actually address the question. Brian Fisher, who headed up ABARE, Dick Warburton, Matt Zemmer, and of course from WA originally, Shirley Intveld, who headed up Verve Energy here in WA, which was the biggest integrator of baseload, traditional forms of power and the renewables. So I would be very confident that those 4 people can have a look at the whole exercise and come up with some of those conclusions.
Chris, you know the answers yourself. I've heard you speak in the Parliament. I mean, we're down by the 2020 to spend $17,000 million on wind turbines, $17 billion. We've got a $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We've got a $3.2 billion Australian Renewable Energy Agency. We've got $8.9 billion spent importing wind turbines. What have we got for it? Electricity prices going through the roof, and the poor damn taxpayer out there subsidising the thing. I mean, that Joe Hockey says the age of entitlement is over. What entitlement do these wind turbine companies have to taxpayers' money?
Exactly right. Well, to put a few things into perspective, I mean, obviously our point with regard to carbon tax, and I heard you discussing that earlier, our belief is that carbon tax at the moment is adding about 9% to the average consumer's electricity bill. And there's a bit of disagreement, and again, the review panel will no doubt have a look and just see what the actual RET is costing. But the opinions differ, but they say somewhere between 3 to 5% of the consumer's electricity price is down to the renewable energy targets. So those are both issues that have got to be addressed. But if I can come back to the United States just for a moment, as you know, shale gas has been the big story in recent times there. It's only 5 or 6 years ago that they were deciding where they were going to put a big offshore gas storage facility for imported gas. Now, we all know now, of course, that shale gas has been discovered. The interesting thing at the end of 2013 is the cost to manufacturers in America of energy, electricity, is half. half
Correct.
what it is to German manufacturers.
Correct. Absolutely.
Now, the impact that is having now and going to have on the American economy and, of course, the geopolitics of the whole world because of this capacity. America is now pretty well close to being self-sufficient, and according to APIA people yesterday, they think it won't be all that long before they're exporting, which, of course, will give us some challenges in terms
Chris,
of our
that's
offshore
coal seam
oil
gas,
and
isn't
gas.
it? That's coal seam gas.
No, it's not. Coal seam gas is relatively shallow. Shale gas is down at about 3,000 metres.
Chris, this country has brown coal reserves of 539 years, black coal reserves of 111 years, and here we are asking wind companies and solar companies to provide renewable energy while we tip out taxpayers' money to keep them going. If I could just turn the page as well on this, because, Graham, there's another issue here which Senator Back has addressed extraordinarily, and it ought to frighten people about the health consequences of this. You asked of wind power, you asked a bloke called Russell Marsh some 2 years ago, then the Policy Director of the Clean Energy Council, and you said to him, or he said to you, I can confirm, the Clean Energy Council, that as far as we're aware, and based on discussions with our wind industry members, landholder contracts don't contain any clauses that would prevent or penalise a person for speaking publicly if they claim to be suffering health effects. You then waved a range of letters in the Parliament, one of which said, this is a fellow having signed to have wind turbines, quote, the landholder acknowledges and agrees that it accepts the noise impacts, which the landholder also agrees will not cause him or her nuisance, and agrees that he or she will not make any claim, objection or complaint, and releases the developer from any claim of liability. I mean, where are we on the health consequences of this, where internationally it's established that wind farm and infrasound, that's the sound of the turbines going round and round, coming into the home, is injurious to health, and here are people being paid to put wind turbines on their property and having to sign these documents.
Look, you make a number of interesting points. When I first became interested in this exercise, in fact, I came back to South Australia, which you mentioned a moment ago, and people used to say, well, if the host is earning $10,000 a turbine on his farm, he doesn't seem to get sick, but if he's not earning $10,000 or he's a neighbour, he does. Well, that was all put to bed by a gentleman and his wife near the Lake Bonnie wind turbine operation in South Australia. This gentleman was actually retired Navy, and his professional field in the Navy was electromagnetics. So he knows a little bit about the movement of sound and other waves through atmosphere. And he actually put his hand up and he said, we are hosts, we are enjoying the benefit, we cannot live because of the health effects. One of the other interesting points I made in a speech the other day when I was very, very critical of the Australian Medical Association, and the Australian Medical Association actually came out and said that wind turbine was a relatively inexpensive and highly efficient means of generation, which of course begged the question to me, if it is so inexpensive, why does the industry need any support from governments at all? And of course that question hasn't been answered. But the other very, very interesting thing, as you've just said, the National Health and Medical Research Council have put out their latest review, and it's actually out for public consultation submission, which I applaud them for, but they came in and said that the jury is still out on health effects.
All right, listen, Chris, I'm sorry, I've got to get you to hold that thought. We are going to have a break. We'll be back in just a moment.
Wonderful, thank you.
Welcome back to Richo and Jones. Look, Chris, can I just ask you one question about this? You've just said that the cost that's in addition now that we've got to put on our electricity prices is 3 to 5%. If we take that off and we take off the carbon tax that was 9% that you said and say we're 12, 14% or whatever it might be, the reality is that the gold plating of the network added much more than that, didn't it? Much more.
That's $167 a year.
Right, yeah, but I'm just saying it added much more, the gold plating. So, I mean, shouldn't the first priority be to stop them doing that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, we don't know what the future holds. We had a very interesting discussion the other day with some proponents in the wind industry, and my colleague Angus Taylor who recently won the seat of Hume,
A Rhodes Scholar.
is a student in this area, and it was a very interesting discussion. He sort of said, well, out at 2020, how much support financially do you think you're going to need? And they sort of said, well, we haven't done the modelling. And he said, yes, you've done the modelling, all right. Tell us what your figure is. He said, I've got mine. You tell us yours. And they eventually sort of said, oh, maybe 1.2 billion a year. He said, well, I think it's closer to 2 or 3 billion a year.
Correct.
So we've got to have that conversation because we are dealing with taxpayers' money. We are dealing, obviously, with a very, very expensive commodity, and that is power. But, I mean, one of the points I wanted to make to you both is that people have said to me, am I opposed to renewables? Well, I'm not. In fact, strangely enough, I had the first operational responsibility for wind turbines in Western Australia. I ran Rottnest Island, a small island off the coast in the late 80s and 90s. And the first ever wind turbines in WA were put on Rottnest. And one of the interesting things was that the only turbine that survived, when it sort of was generating power, we had to turn our diesels, our baseload capacity down to a level of inefficiency that was actually greater than the power that we got from the wind turbines.
Yeah, they are inefficient. They're very inefficient and expensive.
Later, exactly the same things happen.
You're quite. They're inefficient and they're expensive. Now, if Tony Abbott says to SPC Ardmona, we can't prop you up. If he says to Holden, we're not going to run around down the road chasing you with a bucket of money. He says to Toyota, we're not going to chase you with a bucket of money either. Why are we tipping a bucket of money into the proponents of wind, turbine and wind power and solar power? And if, to take the second point, if they're not injurious to health, these turbines going round and round, and infrasound doesn't affect everybody, well, why not put them in Macquarie Street, Sydney, or Kings Park in Perth, or Collins Street in Melbourne? The wind blows there, right next to the beach.
Yeah, you know, it's a very interesting point you make. You hear the advocates of the wind industry saying, oh, look, low energy noise, infrasound, etc. But the interesting point about it is that that's a constant noise. The analogy I'd give you, if you're at a hotel where there's traffic lights and you know that a truck stops, uses its brakes and then takes off again, that's a very different noise sequence to the open road where there's a constant noise. I happened to be in Esperance the other day and we went out to a couple of wind turbine operations at the 9 and 10 mile, as it's called, and the reason being, of course, they're 9 and 10 miles out of town. It's when the blade goes past the tower that you get what's called a crest. And this crest effect is critical because that's the difference between the maximum noise and the average noise. And so this isn't taken into account when people actually talk to you about, oh, well, there's no effect, there's no infrasound effect, Chris, there's no low frequency effect. There definitely is. I heard it myself.
Quite. But, Chris, these people are allowed to build these things and there is no health impact studies done. There have been no health impact studies done everywhere. There has been no research done into this at all. Surely they ought to have to demonstrate, and acousticians say this, acoustic experts, before they should be allowed to even build, they should be able to demonstrate conclusively there are no health side effects. Now, it's clear from a whole heap of people you've spoken to and I have that across Australia there are very significant health effects and they are ignored by your party, the Parliament, and by governments around Australia.
Well, what I'm very pleased to be able to tell you is that, as you know, I put legislation in the Senate last year. When we went to the election, and the commitment has continued since Tony Abbott has become Prime Minister, and that is that we are going to have independent analyses undertaken. Now, if NH and MRC can do it, all well and good. If they can't, then it will be undertaken by independents. We have expertise here in Australia, and we will answer this question, because when the Medical Association put their opinion piece out, they were absolutely swamped from around the world, including a South Australian doctor who was very, very scathing.
Dr. Hopkins.
I repeated this, Hopkins, and you know he's actually, his expertise apart from medicine itself is in occupational health and safety.
Professor Salt from Washington, Professor Salt from Washington, likewise. These are world experts. But to take another point there, Chris, and I know you made reference to this in the Parliament, AGL, one of the wind farm proponents, wrote a letter to 12 medical centres. I mean, this is unbelievable that they could get away with it in southwest Victoria, and only recently discovered, this was 2 years ago, AGL informed the doctors that there was no evidence of health impacts from wind turbines, and they advised the doctors, should any patients present with symptoms they attribute to AGL's turbines, AGL recommends the doctors tell patients to consult either AGL or their website. The website also indicates that there are no impacts from turbines. Now,
well, they just get told you're imagining it.
But how the hell can AGL make this stance? How would doctors, whose obligation is to do the right thing by the patient, yield because patients have written to me and said, well, I heard from the doctor and now I'm not encouraged by the doctor to go back? I mean, this is a fairly insidious thing. You've alluded to this in the Parliament, but the House was empty when you made the comments.
Yes, isn't it interesting? And of course that's backed up now by the Australian Medical Association, you know, the august body that represents them, who have come out and in my view just used a whole stack of literature that's come to them from the wind industry to make these points. And I guess that's what Dr Hopkins was saying, you know, the old Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. So therefore if someone is feeling ill, whether it's psychosomatic, whether it's psychological, whether it's real, who are they going to go to if indeed they're going to walk through the surgery only to find a sceptic in front of them? Again, the analogy I would give, the three of us go out fishing, one of us gets seasick, the other two don't. The person who got seasick, was he sick or wasn't he sick? Of course he is. For the other two to say, oh no, you didn't get sick, it was in your head or it was anxiety or it was psychosomatic, is absolute nonsense.
Yes,
and it does
the
that
problem here, Chris, the problem here is though that doctors can continue to say this. If you never do the basic research, if you never go and find out the answers, then you can never ask the question. And everybody who does ask the question is sent away.
No, but proof that
what are we doing about actually getting this basic research?
Well, it is interesting because, as I say, we've identified now here in Australia acousticians and others who have actually got the expertise to do the independent evaluated work. That's critically important. So, you know, it's fair to say at the moment you've got people who fall one side or the other. Look, this is very, very important stuff. So we've got the expertise, we have the commitment from the Prime Minister that this work is going to be done. And the other thing, of course, as you know, Alan, my background as a rural veterinarian, I've spent my whole life in rural communities. I just don't want to see rural communities being torn apart as we are seeing them. And that's what brought me back to this Flyers Creek, which I mentioned the other day in the Senate, south of Orange. You don't want to see communities where brothers, cousins...
All over Australia that's happening.
Reluctant now to be members of the volunteer bushfire brigade, reluctant to go to CWA meetings.
The MacArthur wind farm in Victoria is in Napthine's electorate, and they are gaining renewable energy certificates when they are in breach of all the conditions that ought to apply to the issue of those certificates. And I should say the AMA, just to come back to that AMA point, has written in that position paper that wind turbine technology, their words, is considered comparatively inexpensive and effective. Now, it's blind ignorance. It's neither inexpensive nor is it affected as an energy source.
Can I just say it's just as well that the boss of the AMA didn't win Griffith, isn't it? It's just as well Labor got up. I'm glad we find something to agree on. Listen, I'm really sorry, Chris, but we have to leave it there. I want to thank you very much, though. I find this discussion fascinating, and this is an issue that won't go away. I have no doubt we'll have you back, but thanks very much for your time tonight.
He's Chris back. That's why
I enjoyed the discussion with both of you. Thank you very much,
Thank you, Chris.
Good on you. Thank you, Chris. And I'll be back in just a moment with some revelations about the real Alan Jones.
Chris back.